Thank you so much for your very kind introduction and for having me here. And imagine opening your daily newspaper to read the headline, "Government agrees to build 100 new cities the size of London." Well, that, together with 30 more the size of Los Angeles, is what 1 billion extra people look like. But rather like a fried egg with a very small yolk and a large sprawling egg white, each of those cities needs a much larger area of land to provide food for its people. We can see that in Britain, where less than 10% of our land surface is urban. 70% is agricultural. Yet still, we are less than 2/3 self-sufficient in our food. And then there's the second population explosion, if you like, in livestock. Every 1 billion extra people on the planet comes with an extra 10 billion farm animals reared and slaughtered every year, the majority of them in factory farms. And when we realize that nearly half the entire usable land surface of the planet is agricultural, then we can see that the planet is already under great strain. It's worth noting that nearly half the usable land surface of the planet, 4/5 of that, 80%, is devoted to meat and dairy. What we can see is that humanity's footprint is already large. Some suggest that we can calculate humanity's footprint through a calculation which goes population times consumption. Some suggest that we can save the planet by simply addressing consumption. I think if we look at runaway meat and dairy consumption in this country, we can see how challenging it can be just to focus on consumption. In the 10 years from 2006, for example, the number of vegans in Britain increased by more than 300%, from 150,000 to more than 500,000. In that same time period, the number of people in the country increased by 5 million. The number of people avoiding meat and dairy were far outweighed by the increase in people choosing to eat meat. Over the last few years, I've been privileged to travel the world looking at our interaction with the natural world, looking at how food is produced and the consequences for farm animals, wildlife, and people. I've traveled to places as diverse as the Amazon, the Cerrado, the savannas of Africa, the terraced plains of China. And what I've come to conclude is that actually that equation for humanity's footprint is actually a little bit more complicated. That actually it's population times consumption times method of production. Over the last 10,000 years, farming has pretty much worked in harmony with nature. But in recent decades, over the last 50 or 60 years, together with an increase in the human population, what we've seen is the rise of a new and particularly damaging form of agriculture, factory farming. What has been happening is things have been disappearing from the countryside. We've seen chickens disappearing from fields and bushes and been put in cages so small that they can't even stretch their wings. We've seen pigs that would build large, elaborate nests for their piglets on woodland margins, taken out and put inside. The mother pigs kept in crates where they can't turn around for weeks at a time and are made to face the wall. We've seen natural herbivores, cattle, taken from fields and pastures to be put into mega dairies and feedlots where they'll be fed grain instead of grass. Welcome to the industrial age of agriculture. It's a great disappearing act, and it's one which is not just confined to the farm animals. What we've seen, for example, near to home in Britain, is that once common farmland birds have been disappearing. Barn owls, skylarks, corn buntings, tree sparrows, grey partridges, you name it, they've been declining. Not just birds, mammals too. Hedgehogs have seen their numbers decline by half since the turn of this century. And then on continents further away, we've seen iconic wildlife and much else disappearing, jaguars in the wake of soya fields to feed factory-farmed animals, and the critically endangered Sumatran elephant swept away as their jungle home shrinks. Over the last 50 years, since the widespread adoption of factory farming and the increase in humanity's footprint, the world has lost more than half of all of its wildlife, 60%. That's more than half of all of the birds, all of the mammals, the fish, the reptiles, the amphibians, gone. And a big part of that is down to the two sides of factory farming. The first side is the one that many of us are now familiar with, where the animals are caged, crammed and confined, which looks like a space-saving idea, but actually isn't. Because then we have to devote large areas of relatively scarce arable land elsewhere to grow crops to feed them. An industrial keeping of animals is accompanied by the industrial production of their food, using chemical pesticides and fertilizers in monocultures, in large fields. And as those fields increase in size and the chemicals come in, so the trees, the bushes and the hedges start to disappear. Those pesticides make sure, and the fertilizers make sure that the wildflowers, the weeds as some call them, the insects disappear, along with the birds, the bats, the bees, the butterflies, and everything else that relies on them for their own living. Even the soil begins to disappear under our feet, leaving us with very little in the landscape but the crop. And then in perhaps the greatest disappearing act of all, we then take that crop and feed it to those farm animals, who then waste the vast majority of the calories and protein in conversion to meat, milk, and eggs. In this way, we waste enough food through intensification to feed an extra 4 billion people on the planet. That's not to say that an extra 4 billion people on the planet at one time is a good thing. It would not be. It would be an environmental disaster. It is to say that we can feed everyone using humane and sustainable farming, using less farming, not more. Yet still, vested interests use population pressure, the growing population, as leverage, as the reason to increase industrial agriculture, to produce more, even though it's the most wasteful way of producing food. And if they get their way, the trend line suggests that we're going to need more cropland to feed all the extra farm animals. We're going to need enough cropland for countries the size, we'll need more cropland for countries the size of France and Italy combined. It means that we'll lose a fifth of the world's remaining forests, including a tropical forest area the size of much of Argentina. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
Millions of people around the world.
You've
come together in huge numbers
for freedom,
for independence,
for women, for our safety, for what you all knew was right,
but against the threat to us all,
a threat to the very balance of life on Earth.
Even we can see you're getting it wrong.
You've done it before.
So let's join together and change the world
before it's too late.
Together we can stop the machine. Factory farming must end.
As humanity's footprint increases, so agriculture expands into more wildlands, causing irreversible damage to biodiversity, to forests, to soils, to water. Causes more wildlife extinctions. Nature is overwhelmed. Using big cats as an iconic example, the explorer and naturalist David Attenborough described how 50 years ago there were 450,000 lions, and we just started halving them each time we added 1 billion people. Today we're at 20 to 30,000 lions, and the same is true for leopards, for cheetahs, and for snow leopards. As nature retreats, she stops giving us vital services such as pollination, carbon sequestration, soil replenishment. Scientists warn that we are in our own new geological era, the Anthropocene. But I think before we get too self-congratulatory about that, we should realize that perhaps one of the biggest victims of the Anthropocene could well be us. Sir David Attenborough, patron of Population Matters, put it that all of our environmental problems become easier to solve with fewer people, and harder and ultimately impossible to solve with ever more people. Humanity is facing some big challenges. Scientists warn that we've 12 years left to solve climate change. Antibiotics, half of which are fed to factory-farmed animals, could soon be useless. Pollinators that are needed for the very existence of 1/3 of all of our food worldwide are in steep decline. Wild fisheries, wild fish stocks could be exhausted within just 30 years. And the UN warns that if we continue as we are, then within just 60 years, the soils could be gone in terms of producing future harvests. No soils, no food. We're on the precipice of a real planetary crisis. But there are positive, life-affirming, ethical solutions that we can take. For example, one of the big things that I believe that we can do to help work our way beyond this crisis is to put much more effort into alleviating poverty and empowering women and girls, methods that are proven to help with population pressure. On consumption, we can rein in our consumption, particularly of resource-intensive meat and dairy. If we carry on as we are, then scientists warn our food alone could trigger catastrophic climate change. And on method of production, well, we need to stop factory farming. We need to stop that machine. No good comes of it. We need to move forward using age-old wisdom of animals in rotational pastures, mixed, soil-enhancing. I believe that there's nothing to fear from making these changes, and actually everything to fear from not doing so. I think the one thing that we do know is for our way of life to remain something like the same. A great deal has to change. As Greta Thunberg puts it, The rules have to change. Everything has to change. And it has to start now. We are the last generation who can hand over a planet worth having as a legacy for our children. So let's get to it. Let's not box off issues and say, well, we'll tackle this one, but not that. Because we can see how these issues link together and how it's no longer a luxury. It's no longer a luxury that we can afford to pick and choose. We've got to tackle things on a much wider, much holistic front. So let's do that. So that whatever form newspapers take in the future, the headlines read positively about a bright future. Thank you very much.